Peter Kai. Let's step into a world where silence is louder than gunfire, and the most dangerous battlefield is a hallway inside the Kremlin. If you're new here, welcome to Peter Kai. I tell high-stakes stories about power, how it's built, how it's protected, and how it slips. If this kind of calm, story-driven narration is your style, subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. And after you finish listening, leave a comment with your theory, because your comments don't just support the channel, they genuinely influence which story I dig into next. Now, let's begin. For more than 2 years, Vladimir Putin has tried to force Ukraine to bend. What was marketed as a fast, special military operation turned into a grinding war that keeps swallowing men, money, and momentum. The front line moves in inches, not headlines, and when a ruler who built his identity on strength fails to deliver a clean win, something else begins to take over: paranoia. Paranoia isn't just an emotion in Moscow, it's a governing style. The Kremlin is designed around control, tight circles, filtered information, loyalty that's constantly tested, and punishment so public that nobody needs to be told what happens when you step out of line. But there's a hidden price in that architecture. The more your power depends on fear, the more you become trapped by it, because you can't tell whether people follow you out of respect or out of survival. And if it's survival, then the second they sense you're vulnerable, the math changes. That's why rumors inside authoritarian capitals are not just background noise, they're early warning sirens. Even if the rumor is false, the reaction to it can be very real. And right now, one rumor is moving through Moscow's elite circles like cold air under a locked door: the idea that Putin could be facing an internal overthrow. This narrative has been amplified by a Russian Telegram channel known as VCHK-OGPU, which claims it has access to sources inside Russia's security services. According to the storyline being pushed, something big is forming, something not led by street protesters or exiled opposition figures, but by someone from inside the machine. And that's what makes it unsettling, because the alleged threat isn't coming from the outside. It's coming from a man who once stood close enough to Putin to be considered part of the permanent structure of the state: Sergei Shoigu. For years, Shoigu wasn't just another official. He was one of Putin's most recognizable lieutenants, Russia's defense minister, a constant presence beside the president, and the kind of figure whose name became woven into the public identity of the war itself. In a system that relies on familiar faces to signal stability, Shoigu was one of those faces. And in Russian elite politics, the most dangerous enemy is often not the loud critic. It's the quiet insider who knows the schedules, the security routines, the rivalries, the weak links, and the unspoken rules. If someone like that turns, it doesn't look like a revolution. It looks like a door opening that was never supposed to open. So what changed? To understand the logic of the coup rumor, you have to rewind to the moment Putin decided to move Shoigu out of the defense ministry. In May 2024, Putin removed Shoigu from the post he'd held for around 12 years. Officially, it could be sold as routine: a reshuffle, modernization, a shift of responsibilities. But in the Kremlin, routine rarely means what it means anywhere else. In the Kremlin, personnel decisions are messages. When Putin keeps someone in a top role for a decade, it signals trust, and it signals that person is woven into the president's protection system. When Putin removes that person during wartime, it signals something darker: blame, doubt, or fear. Because the original promise of the invasion wasn't a long war. It was speed, shock, Kyiv in days, a quick collapse that would make resistance look pointless. And in any system, the people who sell the plan are expected to own the outcome. Shoigu sat at the center of that fantasy, overseeing the institution that was supposed to translate confidence into victory. But the war didn't deliver a clean win. It delivered an open wound. And when a leader can't admit the assumptions were wrong, he looks for someone close enough to carry the weight. Shoigu's removal reads less like routine and more like insulation, Putin trying to protect the center by shifting the heat outward. Shoigu didn't disappear from the state immediately. He was moved to the role of Secretary of Russia's Security Council, a position that sounds powerful to outsiders. But insiders reportedly read it as a demotion, a way to keep him present but contained, visible but less influential. In systems like this, titles can be trophies or they can be cages. Sometimes they're both, and the demotion didn't exist in isolation. Around that period, key figures connected to the defense ministry began facing arrests and investigations framed as anti-corruption measures. In any normal political environment, that might sound like reform. In Moscow, it often reads like a purge in a suit. Corruption in that system isn't just tolerated tolerated, it's functional, it binds people together through shared vulnerability, it creates leverage, it produces silence. So when someone is suddenly arrested for corruption, it can mean they stole too openly, but it can also mean they stood too close to a man whose protection is fading. From Shoigu's perspective, the pattern would have been unmistakable. First the position, then the deputies, then the associates, and after that, the question no insider can ignore: am I next? Here's the cruel logic of Putin's world. A loyal ally is useful until the moment that ally becomes a risk. And once you become a risk, your years of service don't buy mercy. They become evidence that you know too much. And if you want proof that the Kremlin can suddenly wobble when elites stop believing the center is untouchable, remember what happened in 2023, when a private army, the Wagner Group, staged a short-lived mutiny and began moving toward Moscow. That episode didn't overthrow Putin, but it demonstrated something Putin never wanted demonstrated: that armed men could seize space, disrupt authority, and force the state into emergency mode for a day. In a country where the system is supposed to project inevitability, even one day of uncertainty becomes a scar. After a shock like that, the Kremlin doesn't relax. It tightens, it audits loyalties, it looks for future mutinies in every future argument. And a leadership that has already seen one internal rupture becomes far more sensitive to the possibility of another. That brings us to the more recent claims, set in early 2026, suggesting the pressure campaign against Shoigu's circle didn't stop. Another major figure linked to his network, described as a close associate from the Defense Ministry era, is reportedly arrested on charges that include embezzlement, bribery, money laundering, and alleged ties to criminal groups. Whether every detail of those accusations is accurate almost doesn't matter for understanding the political message. The message is, your people are reachable. And in a fear-based system, that is the same as saying, you are reachable. Now put yourself in Shoigu's position for a moment. Imagine spending decades climbing, building connections, collecting favors, balancing clans, speaking the language of loyalty in public while reading danger in private. Then imagine waking up to a new reality where your phone calls don't get returned as quickly, your invitations become quieter, your name is mentioned less warmly, and one by one, the people who made you safe start disappearing into courtrooms. That's not just humiliating, it's existential. Because once your network is dismantled, you can't protect yourself through the system anymore. You're forced to protect yourself from the system. And that is where coup logic begins, not with ideology, but with survival. But then something happens that drags this story out of elite whispers and into ordinary life. The internet goes dark. Reports describe mobile internet disruptions hitting Moscow and St. Petersburg, with complaint trackers spiking and residents struggling to access basic services. Russia has restricted internet access before, sometimes citing drone threats, sometimes citing security, sometimes giving no real explanation at all. But this outage drew attention because of what people claimed to notice about how it worked. The narrative circulating alongside it suggested that access wasn't simply turned off across the board. Instead, some communications allegedly remained available to a select set of approved users through a kind of whitelist. If that's true, it changes the entire meaning of the outage. A blanket outage can be justified as defensive. A selective outage is offensive. It's about controlling who can coordinate with whom, who can organize, who can warn, who can move first. Because here's the key. Coups don't start with gunfire. They start with confirmation. Who's loyal? Who's scared? Which units will move? Which units will hesitate? Who controls which entrances, which corridors, which communications hubs? A conspiracy is fragile at the beginning because everyone involved fears being the only one taking the risk. They don't fear punishment in theory. They fear being the lone fool who believed a promise. Cut communication at that stage, and you don't just slow coordination, you inject doubt. You isolate people from each other long enough for security forces to act first. And if the crackdown is aimed at a particular elite network, cutting communication can function like anesthetic. It dulls reaction time. That's why the internet angle became a centerpiece of the Telegram storyline. According to the claim, the disruptions coincided with investigative activity against people close to Shoigu. Now, I need to be careful here. We are dealing with allegations, signals, and interpretations, some of which may come from sources with their own agendas. Kremlin politics is a fog machine by design. Sometimes the truth emerges only after the fact. Sometimes it never emerges fully. But even without perfect proof, we can still analyze the logic. If Putin believes Shoigu's camp is plotting, he has a palace problem, the kind of problem that can end your rule overnight. And when you face a palace problem, you don't just arrest people. You prevent them from warning each other. You prevent them from organizing. You prevent them from coordinating a countermove. You keep your own trusted circle connected, and you cut everyone else into isolated pieces, and then you watch. Because the most useful information to a paranoid ruler isn't what people say when they're being watched. It's what people do when they think they're alone. And this is where the legal side of the story matters. In February 2026, Russian lawmakers passed amendments that allow the Federal Security Service to demand communication shutdowns, while letting the Russian president personally define the conditions for when communications can be blocked nationwide or regionally without having to publicly explain the grounds. On paper, the justification is safety. But power is rarely written for paper. It's written for moments like this, moments when the Kremlin wants the ability to cut the lights in one part of the city while keeping its own command rooms fully powered. When the state builds an on-demand shutdown system, it isn't only preparing for foreign threats, it's preparing for domestic ones. Even the secondary effects tell a story. When internet disruptions become frequent enough, people adapt. They buy alternatives. They return to analog methods, walkie-talkies, pagers, anything that doesn't depend on a centralized network that the state can flick off like a light. That adaptation matters because it shows a society learning, slowly, painfully, that the system can't be trusted even for ordinary life. But it also forces the state to tighten further, and tightening further reveals fear. Every additional restriction tells the public the government is not confident. Every cutoff tells elites the leader suspects them, and suspicion spreads faster than facts. Now let's pause for a moment because I want you to sit with this. Question 1. If you lived in a capital where communication can be selectively switched off, would that make you feel safer? Or would it make you feel like something serious is happening behind closed doors? I want your honest answer in the comments. Back to the story. Even if there's no coup at all, the Kremlin's behavior, purges, reshuffles, information control, still matters because paranoia itself is a force. A paranoid leader does not need proof. He needs plausibility. He needs one believable scenario where betrayal is possible, and then he acts as if it's already underway. And those actions can become self-fulfilling. If you punish a group of elites long enough, eventually one of them decides there's nothing left to lose. So yes, this entire coup narrative could be exaggerated or even fabricated. In authoritarian systems, rumors are weapons. They can be used by factions to damage rivals. They can be loyalty tests. They can be pretexts for arresting people the center already wanted to remove. Some analysts argue that if Russia's elites truly wanted Putin gone, they would have acted earlier, especially in 2022, when the invasion's risks became obvious and when the shock to the system was greatest. From that perspective, Shoigu might be doing something colder and simpler, allowing his clan to be dismantled in exchange for personal immunity, accepting humiliation now to avoid a worse fate later. That interpretation is not impossible. But even then, one thing remains. Putin's trust circle appears to be shrinking. And when a ruler's trust circle shrinks, the state becomes less flexible, more brittle, and more prone to sudden overreaction. This is where the atmosphere becomes dangerous, because the Kremlin doesn't run on institutions the way stable states do. It runs on relationships, on silent agreements, on competing security agencies watching each other, on the constant question of who controls which lever. And when a leader starts doubting relationships, he weakens the very structure that keeps him safe. Now we get to the geopolitical twist that some commentators have layered over the Kremlin's internal drama. The speculation goes like this. If outside powers appear increasingly willing to pressure regimes through targeted sanctions, isolation, information war, and personal threats against leaders, then Putin may start looking inward for people he fears could be positioned as replacements. In that narrative, Shoigu becomes more than a sidelined insider. He becomes a potential alternative. Not necessarily a friendly one, not necessarily a democratic one, just a figure that could be used in negotiations or presented as the next lever if Putin were weakened. Whether that's actually happening is unknown, but again, Putin doesn't need certainty. He needs fear, and fear changes what a leader does to his own team. It can make him strike first. It can make him arrest people he once depended on. It can make him disrupt the daily life of entire cities just to slow the spread of a whisper. And once that starts, everyone around him begins to calculate their own survival. This is where Shoigu's position becomes uniquely dangerous, because Shoigu is not a stranger to the system. He is a product of it. If he truly is being boxed in, if he believes the next step is not demotion but destruction, then a power play becomes imaginable, even if it's reckless. And if Putin believes Shoigu might move, then Putin's response becomes aggressive, whether Shoigu planned anything or not. That's the spiral. Leader suspects betrayal. Leader clamps down. Elites lose protection. Some elites consider moving first. Leader sees that consideration as proof. Clampdown intensifies. And the state becomes a room full of powerful men who no longer trust each other. That's how regimes break. Not always under foreign pressure, sometimes under internal fear. So what should we watch for going forward? Not bold headlines, not confident statements, not dramatic rumors. Watch for behavior. If more Shoigu-linked figures are arrested, that suggests a widening net. If Shoigu remains out of sight for long stretches, that suggests either isolation, pressure, or a deliberate attempt to keep him from rallying support. If communication restrictions expand, especially in selective ways, that suggests the Kremlin is preparing for internal instability. If the public narrative becomes more aggressive, more talk of traitors, internal enemies, fifth columns, that suggests the leadership is building psychological permission for harsher moves. And now question 2. If you were in Shoigu's position, watching allies get removed one by one, would you stay quiet and hope the storm passes, or would you gamble on moving first? Tell me why. Because your answer reveals how you understand power, as patience or as timing. And I'll leave you with one final thought. Dictatorships often look strongest right before they fracture because they compensate for insecurity with control. They turn the volume up, they tighten the screws, they punish more loudly, they block more channels, they demand more loyalty, but none of that creates trust. It only creates silence, and silence is not stability. Silence is what you get when everyone is afraid to speak, until one day, someone decides to act. If you made it to the end, thank you for listening. If you want more narratives like this, calm voice, sharp analysis, no hype, subscribe to Peter Kai. And if you have a theory about what's really happening inside the Kremlin right now, write it in the comments. I'll be reading. This has been Peter Kai.